Hello YouTube, Kevin here for Superpower Broadcasting. And in this video I'm going to be talking about the idea of the alt-right and their aestheticization of Japan and how in many ways hypocritical and comical it is. And I'm going to be arguing in this video that if you were of an alt-right persuasion, that your actual dreamland and the country which you should be aestheticizing and glorifying is actually North Korea. And I'm going to make this case in this video now as to why this happens to be so. And I'm going to look at the social, economic, and ultimately foreign aspects of the two different countries and ultimately compare them. So, if you spend any time on YouTube, Facebook, meme pages, 4chan, if you browse any of these sorts of websites that tend to have a lot of alt-right people congregating on them, you often come across people that have their profile pictures as random anime, aestheticized cartoon characters or whatever, and they'll usually be super far right-wing, but sometimes, if you're lucky, occasionally you'll see a tanky Stalinist or something, and they'll have the anime pictures too. But I mean, as I discussed quite a bit, the far left and the far right are almost indistinguishable from one another. I mean, socialism in one country and National Socialism are pretty similar. They just have their particular racial chauvinism, and that's about the only difference in some aesthetics. But with this whole idea, of course, is that a lot of the people that subscribe to the whole idea of white supremacy, white nationalism, the idea of anti-globalism, the idea of ultimately anti-capitalism, National Socialism, etc. They'll often aestheticize and be huge fanboys of Japanese foreign media exports, such as anime or manga or whatever else. And I just find that funny because their whole thing, their whole political ideology, of course, is about this idea of nationalism. It's about the idea of, make America great again. The idea that we should stop foreign influences coming into the country, etc. We should stop the globalists. We should, kick George Soros out. That whole sort of thing. Do away with capitalism and go back to a Nazi-type make-work system where you send all the white males out to dig a ditch and then the next day have them filled in and repeat every day for forever so that we can give them jobs. That whole idea. So they all embrace this whole sort of thing that ultimately you see stated more eloquently by people such as Ann Coulter, Tucker Carlson, to some extent, some of the other Fox News hosts, Fox and Friends, etc. And of course, a notable exception here that doesn't get into this stuff is Ben Shapiro, who does actually happen to have some real sort of moral principles and stuff, even though I disagree with him on a lot of stuff. When it comes to economics, he is actually pro-capitalist. He's one of those rare people that are on the center right or further from the center right that actually like capitalism. Almost all the other ones are like, oh, we want National Socialism now, hashtag bring back Hitler or whatever, that whole thing. So, no, Ben Shapiro is actually a capitalist, but all these other guys like Ben Shapiro, Ann Coulter, etc., they've admitted it. Ann Coulter recently admitted that she would vote for Bernie Sanders and take socialism as long as she gets her border wall. And Tucker Carlson had a quote-unquote debate with Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks at Politicon last year. And it wasn't really a debate. They agreed on almost everything except for some aesthetic differences. And, I mean, if we want to just break the whole debate down to a too long didn't read, in essence, they agree on everything except that Tucker Carlson is probably fine with calling Mexicans wetbacks, and Cenk Uygur probably has a problem calling Mexicans wetbacks. But apart from that, halting innovation, halting automation, stopping free trade, ultimately withdrawing and becoming more hermetic becoming more isolationist, going back in time basically to like a 1950s era manufacturing-based economy, going to a more primitive economic mode that's a lot more patriarchal in orientation. They basically agree on the whole thing. They run the gamut. The whole program is almost identical. So Ben Shapiro is one of these only people that stands out, and the alt-right really doesn't like him. And I think it's fair sometimes to lump him into that category on some social issues. He has some overlap with some alt-righters, but they hate him on economics. They hate the fact that he's Jewish, of course. There are a lot of issues where it's unfair to really position him anywhere like that. But almost all the other public intellectuals or whatever on the center right or further at this point are into people like Alexander Dugin or Adolf Hitler or Benito Mussolini, or if you want to get crazy about it, I mean, Bashar al-Assad. Like, there's a lot of overlap where they've got their favorite right-wing fascists and they got their favorite left-wing socialists, and they get it. They know that the political spectrum is basically entangled at the bottom extremity, at the bottom of the circle, where the far right crosses over to the far left and vice versa. They understand that. It's really just some disingenuous people that have an issue with the political spectrum or whatever, the horseshoe theory or whatever as they call it, that want to see things as the center is bad. It's usually the people that are on either the center right or the center left, where they don't really want to acknowledge that they're actually closer to the extremists than they are to the center. But what's interesting here, of course, is that this whole thing with the alt-right in particular is that it comes down to this idea that we want a nationalist society, we want my heritages, we want my uneducated white male to make work projects. Basically, the labor theory of value, which is a really Marxist way of thinking about things, ironically, because you send the uneducated white boys to dig a dam, the central government sends them, and you pay them for it. And then maybe you send them to demolish the dam and then build another one, or you just create all this artificial demand that isn't actually there. And of course the Soviet Union did that, all these other socialist countries did it, and they've all stagnated. It's not a way to run an economy. Adam Smith hundreds of years ago knew that was a stupid way to run the economy, but you've got all these alt-right boys in their basements in 2019 that want to do the labor theory of value, and sure, they'll talk about how Marxism is bad and cultural Marxism is bad, yet they're super into Marxist economics. And so when they aestheticize Japan is very ultra-conservative in a lot of ways on social issues, but Japan still has somewhat of a capitalist economy. They don't really have a liberal democracy, but they're a lot less authoritarian than what the alt-right would ultimately want. It's funny to me to see them aestheticize and glorify and glamorize the anime and all these other Japanese cultural exports in their profile pictures, when I thought that the whole thing was make America great again. I thought that the whole idea was you want white nationalism. I thought the whole idea was you want to celebrate your own ancestors. What are you doing here aestheticizing a different race? I mean, like, I don't care about race, but the alt-right does. They're big on the idea that the whites are the best, basically. So what are they doing with all these Japanese profile pictures? That makes no sense. So, but if they're going to do that, if they're going to choose some country that isn't white to aestheticize and glorify, should be North Korea. Like, I hate North Korea, right? But I also hate the alt-right. But if I was alt-right, I'd probably be pretty down for North Korea. Because what do they have? They've got the wall. They've got 100% homogenous society. They've got an ultra-conservative social structure. They've got full patriarchy. They've got, for all intents and purposes, a kingdom, so they're very reactionary in that regard. A lot of the alt-right people, it varies. Some of them are for the dictator republic model, like Hitler, and then others are for the basically go back to divine right of kings type thing. But in either way, in North Korea, you have the best of both worlds, because it's a socialist republic but at the same time, it's also a reactionary monarchy. It's the best of both worlds from the alt-right standpoint. And of course, they ban all foreign media. Like if your grandfather got caught or accused of listening to a South Korean radio broadcast from the 1950s, like back in say 1951, your family's still going to be in the gulags, even though none of you were him, because Kim Il-sung said that it takes 3 generations of imprisonment in the gulags to wipe out the criminal infestation in the blood, basically. So you basically send a family to a gulag for 100 years, and of course they do collective punishment. A lot of the way that North Korea does things is all about blood and soil. It's all about the idea of guilt by association, the idea of familial shame, the idea that, well, if somebody else in the family commits a crime, the whole family must have criminal blood. The whole idea of North Korea is entirely consistent with the alt-right. There are some cultural aspects of Japan, some social aspects, and some political aspects of Japan too that lend themselves to alt-right aestheticization, but nowhere near the extent of North Korea. North Korea is an alt-right dream world, yet you never see alt-right profiles or whatever going around there trolling or whatever, or posting pro-fascist memes or whatever that have profile pictures of, say, for example, the Flower Girl or those cartoons with the squirrels and stuff or whatever, the North Korean kids shows, all that sort of stuff. It's always Japanese anime, and I'm like, but you're watching a country that basically is a participating member of the world economy. Like, Japan is fairly globalist. They do a lot of trade with other countries. In fact, basically 100% of their oil is imported. They're almost the opposite of an alt-right country on economics. They import so much that it's ridiculous. So much of their energy is imported. So much of their fuel is imported. A lot of the food is imported. They import a lot, and so in that sense, they're very globalist. But then on the other hand, they also export a lot. They export a lot of media abroad. Japanese films and whatnot are very popular in other countries. I thought that was what, cultural genocide or something, you know? Like, if, say, for example, Nigeria did that, and Nigeria had some huge film industry and they were pumping out films into America, I'm pretty sure the alt-right would have a problem with it, and they'd say, no, you know, we want our country, blood and soil or whatever. But they don't have a problem with Japan doing it, even though Japan is also a different race than what they see as the American race, being whites, even though America doesn't have an official race or whatever. But what's interesting, of course, about all this is that I think that part of it, and I spent some time thinking about it, I think part of the reason for this is that the reason why they don't embrace North Korea instead of Japan is because North Korea is actually alt-right. In other words, North Korea doesn't go around exporting their media to the rest of the world because they don't care. They don't care because they view the rest of the world as filth. They view the Japanese as filth and less than human. They view the Chinese as filth and less than human. Don't even get them started, like the regime. Don't even get them started on the Americans, the Yankees or whatever. They see the Africans as dirty. Like, they see the Indians as dirty. They see the Middle Easterners as dirty. They see the Korean people as the cleanest race, and they only care about Korea. Like, that's basically it. And so they don't go around. They make all their media, all their theater, everything is for the consumption of the North Korean masses and nobody else. That's basically it. They're an actual alt-right country in the sense of what the alt-right claim to be about, or what Jared Taylor claims to be about, all this sort of stuff. And Japan, on the other hand, is actually pretty globalist because they export a lot of media abroad. They export a lot of cars, for example. North Korea doesn't really export cars. They produce cars. They have their own car companies, but of course they're government managed because it's a socialist system. But it's a nationalist country. It's what the alt-right wants. They don't go around exporting everything else abroad. They actually have more or less an autarkic juche system, whereas Japan is basically the opposite. They import almost everything they need, and they export everything for profit. They're pretty capitalist. They're pretty globalist. They're not as democratic as they could be, but North Korea is as far away from democracy as you could ever get. Yet you don't see these alt-right kids in their basements with their profiles or whatever. You don't see them aestheticizing North Korean culture, and I just find that funny because North Korea actually does their program. The reason why they don't is because they don't happen to be exposed to North Korean culture. But if you were going to do an alt-right system and you were going to have your country cut off itself from the world, well, it would look a lot like North Korea. You'd only see American TV. You'd only see American state TV. You'd only see American cartoons. You'd only see growing up. Like, the whole thing would just be, you live your life in America, you only see America, you die in America. That's like North Korea. North Korea goes even a step further. If you're born in Pyeongchang province, you're almost certainly going to live your entire life in that province because good luck getting a travel pass to go to the rest of the country. And it's a small country. But no, if you don't have a car, all of a sudden it becomes a big country, and almost no North Koreans have a car because cars are for degenerate capitalist pigs, right? So the whole system is about the glorification of the great leader, the idea of the eternal president, the idea of the 10 million year bloodline of Mount Baekdu. Well, the alt-right's all about the God Emperor with Trump and everything. Now, when Trump did the summits with Kim Jong-un, I felt that a lot of these alt-right people got more exposed to what North Korean culture is actually about, but it hasn't really taken off. And I think part of the reason is that Japan makes better media. Their media is ultimately higher quality, and of course they actually export it. They spend money trying to promote it abroad to make money off of sales, whereas North Korea couldn't care less if the world watched their stuff or they didn't. Because the propaganda that they give their people is that the rest of the world spends all their time admiring Kim Il-sung. So it doesn't matter if you actually sell the stuff because the people are brought up to see themselves as the envy of the world. They literally have a song called Nothing to Envy that they sing, and which lends itself to the idea of the autarkic nationalist socialist model that they have called Juche, the state ideology, which Juche and alt-right are way closer than Japanese neoliberal capitalism, basically. I mean, Japan isn't an entirely neoliberal system. They have quite a bit of corruption between their keiretsu, I believe is the term for it, where they're basically these huge corporate conglomerates that aren't really profitable, but because they buy off so many politicians and they're so well connected, the politicians wire them money anyway. South Korea has a really similar model. I believe the term is chaebol that they have there, like Samsung and whatnot, where they don't really turn a profit, but they don't have to because they're welfare queens, basically, if you want to use the Republican terminology. So they're not entirely neoliberal. They have a much more sort of patriarchal, paternal corporate culture than, say, the United States would or whatever. But North Korea goes even a step above all that, where the government runs all the corporations, and the whole thing is run by the great leader. Everybody serves the great leader, and thus the portraits of the great leader. And so if you're all right or whatever, and you're out there and you've got Japanese profile pictures, something on your accounts, yeah, that's pretty goofy. I mean, the whole thing is goofy, of course. But if you're going to actually be all right, at least be consistent about it, and at least actually aestheticize and glorify a country that actually represents your values. Because North Korea represents those alt-right values and is a vision of an alt-right utopia, and it's a vision of everything that America could be if we would listen to people like Milo Yiannopoulos or Stefan Molyneux or to some extent even some of the ideas of Jordan Peterson, for example. And then, of course, the Red Ice, all these other alt-right, white nationalist media platforms. The idea of Trump was aestheticized, for example, as the God Emperor, all this sort of stuff. That lends itself way more to the North Korean system than modern Japan. Modern Japan is actually pretty capitalist. I mean, they sell a lot of cars abroad, for example. They sell a lot of electronics abroad. North Korea just doesn't export cars or electronics abroad. Everything that they produce is for domestic consumption. And sure, all their stuff basically sucks except for the great leader's mansion. But guess what? That's what would happen if the alt-right actually ran the country. Things would stagnate. All the advantages and innovation would just go to hell. And sooner or later, the U.S. would look like North Korea. So all these National Socialists and everything, Yeah, Japan's not your country. I mean, maybe you could aestheticize Imperial Japan, like the actual fascist Japan from before 1945, but modern Japan is pretty globalist. It's actually pretty aligned with the United States of America. North Korea, on the other hand, definitely a country that you should probably consider. And of course, I think, if the alt-right actually did this, you saw them a lot more sort of aestheticizing and glorifying North Korean cinema, North Korean theatrics, North Korean artwork, etc. It would make them look a lot more goofy. It would kind of expose them a lot more as like, well, oh, you talk about free speech. Why is your profile picture depicting something that Kim Jong-il had created to glorify the Workers' Party of Korea? That makes no sense. Because right now they have all these arguments about free speech, but of course we know that those are just cute talking points so that they can try to swindle their way in power and then give helicopter rides to anybody that disagrees with them. Because they don't care about free speech. It's free speech for the great leader and helicopter rides for everybody else. That's basically what they want, right? So this whole idea, of course, is that it helps their marketing if they're going to have all these aesthetizations of Japanese culture and media exports, because a lot of people consume anime, a lot of people consume manga that don't actually happen to be alt-right. It's a much better way to co-opt those people into your ideology, and it's a lot better way to say, oh, I'm not political, there's nothing political about this, even though if you study this stuff and you browse these forums and everything, you know inherently that there's a very good chance that if they've got these kinds of profile pictures, you're either going to be talking to a staunch Stalinist or a staunch Hitlerite. Like, it's inherently political, especially these days. But there are people out there that consume these things that happen to be Westerners, that just happen to appreciate the culture, happen to appreciate the aesthetics, happen to like the quality of the work and admire a lot of the plot line, a lot of the visionary aspects of media and everything. I don't really watch that much Japanese media at all. As far as foreign media goes, I watch a lot more Russian media. I'm more interested in Russian culture and everything. But in that case, like, I don't agree with the Putin system. I'm against Putin. That doesn't mean that I don't like, Andrei Zvagintsev, for example. I think he's a great film director, and he doesn't really like Putin either. But in this case, right, in this situation, you've got this whole market that you can co-opt, because it doesn't necessarily look that political unless you know the signs that you're looking for. And so you can mask yourself as not necessarily being this crazy extremist. You can slip into and co-opt impressionable minds that maybe aren't that political and just happen to be into, say, Japanese culture or whatever. And you can say, oh, well, I like anime. Have you heard about the great word or the good word of our savior? In their case, they would say like Hitler or something or whatever, or Mussolini, or Donald Trump to some extent. That whole idea of him as like the God Emperor and all this, but. If they did North Korea, it wouldn't be that great for marketing. But it would be more morally consistent. And it would be more intellectually honest if they aestheticized North Korea. Because North Korea is the perfect example of everything they want. It's the best. It's a shining example. Everything about it. The $600 a year GDP per capita. The great leader having $15 billion. The great leader having 100 Mercedes-Benz. The great leader having the swag yacht. Women having to be sex slaves to the great leader, the militarized society to the point where almost a third of the economy gets spent on the military, the national media production, the great block on everything else that isn't domestically produced, the ban on the internet, for example, the racial chauvinism, the idea of the Korean people as the cleanest race. It just goes on and on and on. And that's the thing about this. Of course, the North Koreans, they aren't doing the white supremacist model, but neither is the Japanese culture that gets co-opted by the alt-right. So if they're already willing to take a foreign country that has mostly a different race than them, like white males basically, well, they could definitely do the whole North Korean thing. it would make a lot more sense. But if the leaders are savvy about it, they know that it's easier to co-opt people. And so I think as a marketing tactic, it makes more sense to do the whole aestheticized anime or whatever. And I think another aspect of it, and I'll do a video on this later on, is that there are aspects of some parts of anime and manga that are definitely like pro-pedophilia, whereas North Korea actually is against what they see as degeneracy. The alt-right likes to talk about how they want to cull and purge degeneracy, but they tend to be the most into, child pornography, if they can get away with it with cartoons or whatever. They tend to be the most into drugs. They tend to be the most into just all kind of perverse and morally dilapidated ways of going about their life. They often don't believe in employment or education. Just ridiculous. And then they claim what else? They have this whole idea, this whole worldview of ultimately. It comes down to almost nihilism. Even though they want a state religion, a lot of them aren't religious. They just want to do that because they see it as easier to control the population. It's just goofy, right? And these ideas are ultimately, they've gained ground mostly amongst uneducated white males who I would argue have an external locus of control. Because if they had an internal locus of control, they wouldn't go the alt-right route and complain and whine and want a safe space from the competition. They would get an education and go and make $100,000 a year or whatever and be competitive. But they need a safe space. They're too fragile. They're too much of snowflakes. They want their daddy Trump to give them make work projects that don't add real value to the economy, but their boy Tucker Carlson will argue is necessary to save my heritages and all this other BS. And so it's just a phenomenon that I noticed, and I didn't really see any other YouTubers talking about it. And I just wanted to call it out and bring you guys attention to it, because if you do like I do and browse things like Poll on 4chan or Russia Today or some of the far-right networks on YouTube to keep up with the talking points of the enemy, well, you'll see a lot of these profiles and everything, and you tend to notice patterns, right? Watching anime, being in anime, doesn't make you alt-right. But if you're alt-right, you're probably into anime. Like, there are things about it that are just, they lend themselves to it. And it would just make a lot more sense if they were into the Korean media. And actually, since Kim Jong-un took over as basically Kim III in North Korea, some of their children's broadcasting and their adolescent broadcasting, if you watch, say, like Stymies Korea, even though he's a total tanky and glorifies a lot of it, you can watch and get a sense of what the average North Korean in the capital is actually exposed to. Now, of course, we know the average North Korean probably doesn't even have a television and has one pair of clothes to last them their entire life and has to work the crops with no augmentation whatsoever. They have an ox and they have some wood, and that's how they're supposed to subsist on. But to the 10% elite that are privileged enough to be allowed to live in the capital, the cartoons and stuff that they're exposed to, it's actually pretty high quality. I mean, it's not quite as well animated as some of the Japanese children's programming and everything is, but it's definitely better than it was under Kim Jong-il. North Korea today, at least in the capital, is a lot more stylized and a lot more higher definition now than it used to be. So it could definitely lend itself to being aestheticized by the alt-right, but they either don't do it because the masses of them don't know anything about North Korea, and if they know anything about North Korea, it's probably, oh, Kim and Trump didn't get along and now they get along. They don't understand the actual cultural aspects of North Korea. They don't understand enough about North Korea to know that that's actually their dream country. They think of Japan as their dream country, even though Japan is in some ways more capitalist than the United States and exports and imports at a higher percentage in many ways than the United States in terms of what they produce and in terms of their GDP. But what's interesting about the whole thing is that their leaders, of course, are probably savvy and probably wise to the idea that North Korea is actually what they want, but branding yourself as aestheticizing Japan also makes it more palatable because Japan is in some ways considered a Western country. It's an ally of the United States. You can go there and not be arrested and accused of being a spy, whereas in North Korea, that's almost a guarantee. I mean, just look at what happened to Otto Warmbier. Look at what happened to all these other people that go over there and get accused of proselytizing or stealing banners or speaking ill of the great leaders, etc. Japan is seen as a lot more moderate, reasonable country. So if you have North Korean views but dress it up as Japan, well, it makes it a lot more accessible. It makes it a lot more palatable to people. And it's a better way to co-opt people. And ultimately, that's one thing that the alt-right is generally pretty good at doing. It's one thing that a lot of their sponsors in Russia that produce a lot of memes are really good at doing is co-optation. And so yeah, it's just a phenomenon. And if you guys are on YouTube and everything and happen to see this or any of these other forums, just remember that, yeah, actually what they want is North Korea. They don't want us to be like Japan. They want us to be like North Korea. So stay on guard, my friends.